Felix Mendelssohn was a little boy, he and his brother and sisters used to act out Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a play about mysteriously shifting identities and love that turns to hate. This film reveals how the story of the play became Felix's own story. Almost nobody knows about it. I only know because it's also the story of my family. Felix Mendelssohn was my great-great-great-great-uncle. 90 years after his death, his music and the family were very nearly written out of history, because culture, and especially music, were right at the heart of the Nazi struggle to reinvent Germany. Felix Mendelssohn was an even greater prodigy than Mozart. He began publishing his music at the age of 10 and wrote his first opera at 12. His music has always been loved for its accessibility and its gorgeous tunes. Unusually among boy geniuses, Felix the person was also very popular.
And he was really the most beloved musician of his time. Apparently when he came here to London, the musicians would just go crazy the moment he walked in for the first rehearsal. But I think, I have to say, above all, I love the fact that he was a great, great composer. And you can just feel the greatness of his soul through his music.
But beyond the charmed life and the lovely tunes was something else that would come back to attack the family and Felix's music a century later. Felix, the German national treasure, was also a Jew.
This is the Dictionary of Jews in Music. This is a particularly nasty piece of work which the Nazis put together, and it's very curious because many of the entries are very, very short, but then on a couple of composers or a couple of performers, suddenly you have these diatribes of hatred. For example, if we turn to M and we find Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn takes up almost 3 pages, and it says, "This has shown us that a Jew with such a rich and specific talent has not managed even once to find any kind of depth, heart, or soul in any of the art with which he's been associated." I mean, it's positively revolting.
I've always known I was a Mendelssohn, but I've never understood the weird sense of not belonging that seems to pervade the family. Now it turns out to be all about religion. My dad and his cousins first experienced it as children in Nazi Germany. They won't be around much longer. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I want to put their stories on record. Let's start with my dad. Until he was 12, he lived in Cologne, and he thought he was just like all the other German boys.
There were, of course, all the Nazi stories. And there used to be these little placards on the walls saying all the things that the Jews were doing. And of course, it's nothing to do with me. But then slowly it turned out that it was something to do with me, and I'm not quite sure how that happened. So it dawned on us gradually that the Jews were really dreadful people, but only slowly that in some sense I was one of them.
So that was when he discovered he was Jewish, but he'd started out Lutheran, and since then he's been Anglican, Quaker and Muslim. Each change of identity, a search for somewhere to belong. My dad's great-great-great-uncle Felix was also concerned about his identity. You can see that in his fascination with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Dad had his own encounter with the play soon after he arrived in England. Tell us about your relationship with this play.
Well, it so happened that the school play in Christmas 1938 was A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I was good at learning things by heart, so I was originally given the part of Bottom. But I never succeeded in speaking with a sufficiently clear English accent. So I was resigned to a less important role, namely that of Egeus, the father of one of the girls. A rather bad-tempered father, and they've thought that this particular character fitted me perfectly.
Felix's two uncles made the first translation of the play into German. And when he was only 17, Felix wrote the famous overture. The play's theme of transformation is knitted right into his music.
The very opening of the overture begins with these 4 mysterious chords. Franz Liszt described these as if they were drooping eyelids. You would imagine yourself falling asleep. You're entering this dream-like world. What Mendelssohn does is to take these 4 notes, and they go through a series of transformations, a series of metamorphoses, which is Mendelssohn's musical parallel to the metamorphoses in the play. So, for instance, this one later becomes, but up here in a higher register, that would be the pattern for the hour, so you get this. Or he'll rework them into major form, so you get this. Even the music for the lovers, this second theme, you can hear how he's taken the 4 notes and sort of compressed them, so you get. They're all linked together, and it's a kind of marvelous way of sort of tying together these themes. The idea of metamorphosis and of identities being mixed up and being corrected is something he probably would have reflected on in terms of his own situation and figuring out who he was.
It turns out that the family's uncertain identity and the problems that came with it go back 7 generations to the middle of the 18th century. They kicked off with a Jewish boy who dared to come to Berlin at a time when it was difficult and dangerous to do so. He was Felix's grandfather, my 5 times great-grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn.
To see what Moses Mendelssohn was, you have to understand that he is the first point of contact between Jews and Christians on the continent of Europe since, I suppose, the Crusades. After that, there was separate and parallel development. The Jews were locked in their ghettos, and the Christians ruled the land. Now, think of this. 1743, a boy of 14 leaves the town of Dessau and walks 100 miles to Berlin, probably barefoot.
In the 1740s, only the richest Jews were allowed into Berlin. Most others were just turned away at the gates. But the 14-year-old Moses was determined to get in. To him, Berlin was a city rich in possibility.
Somehow, he talks his way in. And once he's inside the city, he is almost immediately liberated because he's come into the world of enlightenment, where the curious can educate themselves and become thinking members of society. And he's enormously taken by this idea.
Moses was out in the world. He learned German, which most other Jews still refused to do, and used it to write and publish his ideas. The most revolutionary was that Jews and Christians could and should live in the same society. It made him famous. He was known as the German Socrates. Dad's cousin Cecile still talks to Moses every day, even though he's been dead for 200 years. Cecile loves Moses because he found common ground between people.
He loved people, And he loved people because they were people. And that's absolutely not important, whether you are a Jew, whether you are not a Jew, and so on. Important is that you believe in God. And God, if I may see him after my death, won't ask me what kind of belief I had, but what I did with him.
Moses' powerful ideas began to blur the definition of what it is to be Jewish. Is it a religion or something you're born into? Are you still Jewish, even if you don't practice or believe? If you are Jewish, what difference does it make? In Moses' day, the law defined Jewishness as a religion. Practicing Jews like him didn't have the civil rights or freedom to travel other Germans had. His son, Felix's father, Abraham, waited until Moses was dead, then took the logical next step. In 1816, when he was 7 years old, Felix, the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, the greatest Jew of the Enlightenment, was baptized into the Lutheran Church. For the rest of his life, Felix had to balance loyalty to his grandfather and his roots with his new and passionate Christian faith. 120 years later, Dad's cousin Ria also found herself changing religions, but without knowing it. She, like Dad, had always been Protestant. But when she arrived at her new school, there was a surprise waiting for her.
First day I had to go to school. Our teacher said the Protestants to the left and the Catholics to the right. And I went to the Protestants, of course, because our parents hadn't told us they were converted. But the teacher said, I know you are Catholic. And they gave me two girls, right and left, and they brought me into the church. And I didn't know to make this. So it was a drama for me.
Ria now had to learn to be Catholic. Unlike Felix, she didn't yet know that she was also Jewish. Felix welcomed his conversion, especially for the music. It's hard to believe now, but Bach, Germany's greatest Christian composer, had pretty much disappeared in Felix's day. Ironically, it was Felix's Jewish grandmother who had Bach's St. Matthew Passion copied out by hand for his 15th birthday.
We have to imagine a 15-year-old musical prodigy discovering this music. He was already deeply into Bach's music. When he acquired this manuscript, he opened it up, and this is what he heard. Mendelssohn once wrote that the music of Johann Sebastian Bach transformed every concert hall into a church. He was making two statements. He was declaring on the one hand that he was a Bachian. It's a musical profession of faith, as it were, but it also was a very deep spiritual profession of faith as well for Mendelssohn.
5 years later, Felix revived the Passion for the first time in a century. For him, adopting Christian music and Christian religion were one and the same. Bach's chorales often appear in Felix's music, sometimes mixed in with echoes of the synagogue.
It's a fascinating mixture. You have these moments of Judaism in Mendelssohn, and then, of course, a lot of his music is very Protestant.